Door open, door open, door open. Stay where you are. Stay there. Just stay where you are for now, sir. Okay, we've got a warrant to search the premises.
Alright.
What's your name?
Ross again. Oh, no.
You're going to be under arrest,
Yeah.
okay? So it's 6:02.
Across the UK, it's normal to see workers in high-vis jackets digging up roads. Most people walk past without thinking twice. But for 4 years, a gang used that to their advantage, hiding a huge criminal operation in plain sight. They called their company Elevate Civils and Utilities, and on the surface, it looked like a real business. Their workers wore proper uniforms, used branded vans, and set up safety barriers like any other road crew. But they weren't fixing power lines. They were stealing electricity. That stolen power was then used to grow huge amounts of cannabis for Albanian crime gangs. Police say the gang helped run over 100 secret cannabis farms across the country, from old shops to empty hotels. The farms made drugs worth more than £21 million. And the group didn't just do this once or twice. They carried out jobs in more than 30 different police areas. At the heart of it were two men who acted like they were running a small utility company. But behind the scenes, they were helping power one of the biggest illegal cannabis networks the UK has seen. This is the story of how fake electricians built a drug empire and how they finally got caught. To understand how this gang fooled the country for years, we need to start with the men who ran the operation: Andrew Roberts and Ross McGinn. On paper, they were just two directors of a small utilities company based in Wigan. Their company, Elevate Civils and Utilities, had all the signs of being legitimate. They used real safety equipment, posted regular updates on LinkedIn, and even shared photos of roadwork jobs. If you saw them digging up a road, you'd think they were fixing a power line or installing new cables. But this image was a front. In truth, Roberts and McGinn were working with organised crime groups, particularly Albanian gangs, to set up illegal cannabis farms across the UK. These farms weren't just in houses on back streets. Police found them in abandoned pubs, department stores, hotels, and even nightclubs. The scale was industrial, and to run them, they needed huge amounts of electricity. Rather than pay for it, the gang stole it. Roberts and McGinn sent their workers to dig into public streets and splice into live power cables. The stolen electricity was then secretly routed into cannabis farms, giving them the energy needed to run high-powered lights, ventilation, and irrigation systems. This kind of setup can use more electricity than an entire block of homes, so the cost saved by stealing it ran into the millions. Their method was bold. The workers, some knowingly involved, others simply following orders, wore full safety gear and used proper signage. Passers-by would assume they were part of the council or a utility provider. The group would dig into roads and pavements without any permits or licenses, working in the open during daylight hours. No one stopped them, no one questioned it. They relied on the trust that people naturally give to anyone who looks official. Inside the company's Wigan base, police later found vans, diggers, generators, cabling, and everything else needed to fake real roadworks. They even found evidence that jobs were booked across multiple counties at once. Roberts and McGinn weren't just involved, they were leading the entire scheme, working directly with criminal groups who paid them to install illegal electricity feeds into grow houses. The gang charged a fixed rate for their services. They weren't growing the cannabis themselves, but they made the grow operations possible. They were the link between the property and the power, taking a cut from each setup and moving on to the next. Over time, their role became critical to the supply chain. For a while, the operation worked smoothly. They had a system, they had contacts, and they had the confidence to keep going because the streets gave them cover. But what they didn't count on was how closely people were watching, or how quickly things would fall apart once someone started asking questions. By the time police caught on, more than 100 cannabis farms had already been powered using stolen electricity. The damage was done, but the investigation was just getting started. At first glance, it looked like normal roadwork. The team arrived early, wearing fluorescent jackets, setting up barriers, and laying out tools next to marked vans. To the public, they blended in with everyday life, just another group of workers repairing cables or fixing a fault. But behind this routine setup was a criminal enterprise operating across England, Scotland, and Wales. The gang used the same playbook at each site: A quiet street or back road would be chosen, usually near a building already prepared to house a cannabis farm. Then, without permits or permission, the crew dug into the pavement to access underground electricity mains. Once the cables were exposed, they installed a secret feed that diverted power directly into the nearby property. The stolen supply was enough to power entire grow operations, sometimes running for months without detection. It was risky. Cutting into live electrical mains is not only illegal, but extremely dangerous. In one case, an image found on a suspect's phone showed one of the men with a burned and blistered face, likely caused by a cable exploding during work. In another incident, a passerby recorded footage of sparks flying from a pavement in Middlesbrough as the crew hit a live wire. These weren't skilled engineers. They were criminals gambling with their lives and the safety of everyone nearby. Still, the method worked because of how ordinary it looked. The use of company logos, safety signs, and equipment created a layer of protection. People assumed they were authorized to be there. Drivers slowed down without question. Pedestrians crossed the street to avoid the work zone. There was no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The jobs were often done in just a few hours. Once the feed was connected and hidden from view, the team packed up and left. No reports filed, no inspections triggered. The buildings they powered were already being fitted out for cannabis growing. Inside, the rooms were sealed off, lined with foil and filled with high-wattage lights, fans and water systems. The gang never stuck around to see the results. They just delivered the power and moved on. What made this operation so successful for so long was its simplicity. By copying the look of real street workers, they bought themselves time and space. And by choosing quiet locations and quick jobs, they stayed ahead of attention. But as the number of grow houses increased and the operation expanded, it became harder to stay invisible. Eventually, neighbors started asking questions. Utility companies noticed gaps in billing data. And when one cannabis farm was uncovered in North Wales, police began to retrace every suspicious worksite. What followed was a nationwide investigation into a gang that had stolen millions of pounds worth of electricity and left a trail stretching across more than 30 police forces. While the men in high-vis jackets drew little attention above ground, the spaces they powered below told a different story. Behind shuttered doors, boarded-up windows, and faded signage, over 100 properties were converted into large-scale cannabis farms. These weren't small grow rooms run by a few locals. They were commercial-level operations, some stretching across entire floors of old department stores or the cellars of closed pubs. Inside, police found rows of cannabis plants packed tightly under intense heat lamps, irrigation pipes snaking across floorboards, and carbon filters humming in the background. The farms were designed for one thing only: production. From the moment a site was connected to stolen power, it was filled with soil, pots, and equipment. Growers, often Albanian nationals, were brought in to live on site, rarely leaving the buildings. Some were trafficked, forced to work under constant surveillance, sleeping beside the plants they tended. When police eventually raided these properties, they found makeshift beds, bags of clothes, and even rationed food supplies stacked against walls. In many cases, the gardeners claimed they were brought to the UK with promises of work or safety, only to be trapped inside these converted drug factories. The conditions inside the farms weren't just cramped, they were dangerous. Live wires ran along damp walls, floorboards had been ripped up to run cables underneath, and many of the lighting setups were rigged with little regard for safety. Some sites had already caught fire or shown signs of electrical faults. One officer described walking into a building where the air was so thick with heat and chemical fumes that breathing without a mask became difficult within minutes. These weren't just illegal farms, they were fire hazards waiting to go up. Yet for all the risks, the profits were enormous. A single large farm could yield hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of cannabis in a few months. The gangs using Elevate services didn't have to worry about permits or electricity bills. With each grow house powered by a direct stolen line, their overheads were practically zero. The gang's clients simply paid Elevate's fee and let the operation run until harvest. And when one site was raided or shut down, a new one was already waiting. The scale and speed of the network meant that no single farm was critical to the business. If Bangor lost a setup, Manchester had another. If a pub in Preston was shut down, a nightclub in Luton was already sprouting new crops. The gang had turned illegal cannabis farming into something terrifyingly close to an industry. The only link between these operations was the power, and that power had a single source: Roberts, McGinn, and their fake roadwork crews. Without electricity, the farms went dark. Without Elevate, the system stalled. That made their role invaluable to the wider network. Eventually, it was the farms themselves, the smell, the heat, the tampered meters, that helped point officers toward the true scale of what was happening. But back then, the network was still growing, unnoticed by most, hiding behind closed doors and false walls. And it was feeding a market that only seemed to grow larger by the day. The operation might have looked airtight from the outside, but cracks began to appear in the most ordinary ways. It started with a single cannabis farm discovered in an abandoned shop on Bangor High Street. Local officers responding to reports of suspicious activity found more than £1.2 million worth of plants inside, rows of them stacked wall to wall with industrial lighting and an elaborate ventilation system. The wiring, however, was what stood out most. It hadn't been connected through a legitimate meter. Instead, it had been pulled straight from the high street's underground electricity lines. Engineers called to inspect the setup confirmed that the connection had been made illegally and dangerously. Whoever had installed it knew enough to avoid triggering alarms, but not enough to keep the public safe. There had been small explosions, power surges, and even blackouts in the area around the farm. CCTV footage gave investigators their first break. Days before the farm was uncovered, cameras showed a group of men in high-vis jackets digging on the pavement nearby. They were using branded vans marked Elevate Civils and Utilities. From a distance, they looked legitimate, but when police checked with local councils and utility companies, none had any record of planned work in that area. That's when suspicion started to grow. Investigators followed the trail back to Elevate's offices in Wigan. A warrant was issued, and inside, officers found more than they'd expected: diggers, vans, tools, and even maps. There were notes detailing job locations, invoices for equipment, and photos taken at dig sites across the UK. Other raids followed. In McGinn's home, police found bundles of cash and mobile phones loaded with messages about future jobs. Some messages referenced live jobs in progress. One even discussed the price of reconnecting a grow house that had gone dark after a power fault. Each clue peeled back another layer, revealing just how far the gang's work had spread. They weren't targeting one city or region. They were working nationwide, quietly feeding the black market while pretending to dig up streets. The case had started with a single illegal connection. Now it was becoming clear the whole country had been their worksite, and they'd hidden in plain sight the entire time. Once the scale of the gang's activity became clear, the investigation turned into a major national operation. Detectives from the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit took the lead, coordinating with dozens of other forces across the UK. Elevate Civils and Utilities had been active in 32 different police areas. The job now wasn't just to stop the group, but to figure out how much damage had already been done. More than 100 buildings had been transformed into illegal cannabis farms. Some were in quiet suburbs, others in the middle of busy towns. Former hotels, pubs, department stores, even nightclubs, all were stripped out and converted into grow sites. Inside, officers found thousands of plants, tangled wiring and power connections running directly from street cables. Each raid uncovered more grow houses, more stolen electricity, and more links back to Roberts and McGinn. Investigators found evidence of how methodically the gang had worked. They'd built a business model around illegal installations, charging criminal gangs a set fee for setting up power supplies, with the option of revisits and fixes if anything went wrong. Crucially, police also began to identify the people supporting them. Ground workers like Greg Black, Lewin Charles, and Aidan Doran had taken part in the digging and installations. Some had criminal records, others didn't, but all played a role. Then there was Colin White, who had worked for Scottish Power. He stole specialist tools and passed them to the gang, making the illegal work easier and faster. Searches at the company's HQ revealed even more: unregistered vehicles, stolen tools, and schematics of underground cables in multiple towns. McGinn and Roberts had clearly planned each job, choosing sites carefully and moving quickly once payments were made. As the evidence stacked up, the network began to collapse. Arrests were made across the country. Some gang members cooperated, others lawyered up, but the trail was now too strong to ignore. Police had the documents, the CCTV, the tools, and most importantly, the power lines themselves, all leading back to the same place. What had started as a seemingly clever scheme was now fully exposed, and for those at the top, time was running out. By early 2025, the case against the gang was complete. Investigators had tracked years' worth of illegal jobs, recovered tools and vehicles, and tied each suspect to a specific role. The courtroom at Liverpool Crown Court became the stage for one of the most unusual organised crime trials the region had seen, one that centred not on drugs directly, but on the stolen power that kept the entire network alive. Andrew Roberts and Ross McGinn were the first to plead guilty. Both admitted to conspiracy to abstract electricity and encouraging or assisting an offence. Roberts, who had run the company's logistics, claimed he'd only started helping the gangs for money. McGinn, visibly emotional in court, said he'd been overwhelmed by the pressure and had made a huge mistake, but their guilt wasn't in question. The evidence showed they'd played an active role in over 100 cannabis farms. The judge didn't hold back. He said the men had used a mask of legitimacy to carry out a large-scale criminal enterprise in plain sight. He pointed out that the workers wore high-vis gear, operated in daylight, and fooled communities into thinking they were public contractors, when in fact, they were feeding organised drug production. The harm, he said, wasn't just financial. The illegal connections posed real danger, from fires to explosions, putting entire streets at risk. Roberts was sentenced to 6 years. McGinn, who had wiped away tears during the hearing, received 5 years and 4 months. Ground workers Greg Black, Lewin Charles, and Aidan Doran all pleaded guilty and received sentences ranging from 2 years and 8 months to just under 4. Colin White, the Scottish Power employee who had stolen equipment, was jailed for 2.5 years. Not everyone went to prison. Another man, Sherry, received a suspended sentence and community service. But the message from the judge was clear. This was a sophisticated operation, driven by greed, masked by deception, and spread across the UK. In total, the sentencing marked the end of a sprawling investigation, one that uncovered not just a criminal scheme, but the ease with which it had infiltrated everyday life.